Imagine for a moment the vast African continent, this ancestral cradle of humanity, where every drop of water carries echoes of ancient civilizations and whispers secrets of uncertain futures. We are immersed in the year 2026, and the geopolitics of water scarcity in Sub-Saharan Africa emerges not as a mere footnote in global agendas, but as the central axis of a chessboard, where nations move like pieces, external powers weave webs of influence, and entire communities fight for their very survival. Legendary rivers like the Blue Nile, the Congo, the Volta, the Zambezi, and the Chari transform into living borders of tension, where water is not just a vital resource, but a currency of power, a catalyst for fragile alliances, and the spark for conflicts that could redraw the political map of the region. While the world distracts itself with debates on artificial intelligence, cyber supremacy, and space races, here, in the pulsing heart of Africa, a silent crisis threatens 250 million lives, projected to reach 500 million by 2030, according to alerts from international organizations tracking the drama for decades. This is not a story of academic abstractions, but of mothers walking dozens of kilometers under merciless suns in search of a bucket of water, fishermen watching nets return empty for the first time in generations, national leaders weighing the cost of a dam against the risk of declared war. To truly grasp the depth of this saga, we need to go back in time, dive into the historical layers that paved this arid path of hydraulic disputes. Let's start with the Nile, this fluvial titan that sustains the life of 10 countries and irrigates the lands of over 300 million people. More than 7,000 years ago, the first Nilotic communities in Ethiopia and Sudan built villages along its banks, taming the seasonal floods to cultivate barley, teff, and sorghum on black, fertile soils. The Egyptian pharaohs, fascinated by its regenerative power, named it Iteru, the primordial river, erecting grand temples like Abu Simbel in its honor, and developing a calendar based on its annual inundations. But the modern history of Nilotic hydropolitics was born in the 19th century, with European colonization drawing arbitrary borders that ignored watershed basins. In 1888, the Anglo-Italian Treaty recognized Egypt as the natural proprietor of the Nile, a declaration that completely excluded the Ethiopian highlands, responsible for 85% of the Blue Nile's flow. This colonial hydraulic doctrine crystallized in 1929, with the agreement between the United Kingdom and Egypt guaranteeing Cairo veto power over any upstream project, followed by the 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan, which divided Nile waters at 55 billion cubic meters for Egypt and 18 billion for Sudan, allocating 0 to the other 8 basin countries. This unfair legacy fermented resentment for generations. In Ethiopia, emperors like Haile Selassie dreamed of water sovereignty, but lacked resources. It was only in 2011, after decades of planning, that the government of Mele Zenawi laid the foundation stone for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, a pharaonic project of 6,000 megawatts capacity, equivalent to the Itaipu power plant, designed to irrigate 9 million hectares and electrify a nation where 40% of the population still lived without electricity. Imagine the scale, a reservoir of 74 billion cubic meters, 9 generating units of 375 megawatts each, financed by $5 billion in Chinese loans, domestic bonds, and popular contributions that raised $1 billion in months. For Ethiopians, the GERD is not just infrastructure, it is national redemption, a cry of independence against centuries of hydraulic subjugation. But for Egypt, whose agriculture consumes 95% of its fresh water and supports 60 million Nile dependents, it represents an existential threat. Hydrological models predict that the initial reservoir filling, which has taken 15 years so far, will reduce downstream flow by 25% in the first years, potentially cutting rice and cotton production by 30%, triggering mass famine in the Nile Delta. The negotiations around the GERD read like a diplomatic thriller. Tripartite meetings in Washington in 2019 collapsed when Egypt demanded external oversight on filling. Addis Ababa refused, citing sovereignty. In 2021, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi publicly declared that all options are on the table, a euphemism for military intervention, echoing generals training bombing scenarios against the gates. Ethiopia responded by mobilizing Turkish Bayraktar drones and reinforcing defenses with Russian advisors. Sudan, caught in the middle, wavers. It benefits from flood regulation by the dam, but fears prolonged droughts on sesame plantations. By 2026, the reservoir has reached 80% capacity, and tensions explode in minor incidents, like temporary gate closures that left Sudanese farms with controlled flooding, but accused as sabotage. We don't isolate the Nile from this larger tapestry. We shift to West Africa, where the Volta River winds through Burkina Faso, Ghana, Togo, and Ivory Coast, sustaining 120 million people in one of the planet's fastest-growing population regions. The Akosombo Dam, built by Americans in 1964 with double the storage capacity of the Three Gorges, generates 80% of Ghana's electricity and irrigates cocoa plantations that represent 20% of national GDP. But Burkina Faso, upstream, launched the Soum project in 2020, a 190-megawatt dam diverting 200 million cubic meters annually to its semi-arid lands. The result? Record droughts in southern Ghana in 2024, with losses of 500,000 tons of cocoa, leading Accra to accuse Ouagadougou of hydraulic theft. In retaliation, Demayan forces bombed Burkina Bay canals in a defensive operation, killing 20 civilians, and escalating to mediation by the Economic Community of West Africa, whose quota resolution remains a dead letter. This dispute exemplifies the classic dilemma. Upstream nations prioritize development, downstream, preservation of the status quo. Further north, the Lake Chad Basin paints an even more desolate picture. Once the world's sixth largest inland lake, with 25,000 square kilometers in 1960, it has shrunk to less than 2,500 in 2026, a 90% loss caused by desertification, overfishing, and irrigation diversions in Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. 40 million people depend on it for fishing, agriculture, and drinking water, but fish yields have fallen 80%, fueling mass migrations. Groups like Boko Haram and the Islamic State in the Sahel exploit the chaos. Fulani fishermen, deprived of livelihood, join militias promising protected wells, turning scarcity into armed insurgency. In 2025, clashes between Fulani herders and Kanari farmers in Nigeria killed 15,000, while China advances an ambitious water transfer canal from the Congo River, budgeted at $25 billion, promising to inject 6 billion cubic meters annually into Chad, in exchange for exclusive concessions in Nigerian uranium, Chadian cobalt, and Cameroonian gold. This Chinese pipeline diplomacy secures critical supplies for the global energy transition, while local communities see little immediate relief. Now let's descend to the community level, where the crisis pulses with raw, visceral human life. In Gondar, in the Ethiopian highlands, Amhar peasants watch teff fields, the base of the national injera, wither under scorching suns, while the Gerd fills its reservoir. Women like Fatima, a mother of 5, wake at 3 in the morning for 25-kilometer walks to the nearest well, carrying 20-liter jerrycans on raised heads, a burden consuming 40% of the day and preventing girls from attending school. In the Egyptian Nile Delta, Alexandria fishermen report 70% reduced catches, nets returning algae instead of tilapia, forcing migrations to overcrowded Cairo, where the Muslim Brotherhood recruits with speeches of pharaonic hydraulic injustice. In the Nigerian Sahel, Tuareg nomads, once desert lords with camel trains loaded with salt, now lead armed convoys with AK-47s against Hausa villages for seasonal wells, turning ancestral trade routes into war zones. These stories are not statistics. They are the torn fabric of society, where water scarcity raises extremism by 40%, according to global think tank studies, fueling cycles of violence across generations. Global powers hover over this cauldron like patient condors. China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, has built or financed dams in 19 sub-Saharan countries, controlling 25% of projected African hydroelectric capacity by 2030, from Mozambique to Gabon. In exchange, strategic minerals flow to Shanghai, Congolese cobalt for Chinese Tesla batteries, Angolan lithium for solar panels, Canadian rare earths for Huawei smartphones. The United States, revitalized by President Trump's re-election in 2024, launches the Partnership for African Infrastructure and Resilience, injecting $10 billion into projects in Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia, but with anti-China clauses prioritizing geopolitical containment over immediate relief. Russia, via the Wagner Group evolved into Africa Corps, trains special forces in Mali and Niger in exchange for aquatic phosphates and alluvial gold, supplying fertilizers and small arms to stabilize volatile regions. The European Union, tormented by Mediterranean droughts, imports Congo lithium and cobalt artificially irrigated, funding canals that dry Lake Kivu and release accumulated methane, a catastrophic environmental risk. Future scenarios branch like unpredictable river deltas. In the worst, hot water wars erupt in 2027, Egypt, desperate with record-low Lake Nasser levels, launches cruise missiles from Rafale jets against the GERD gates, causing controlled flooding that kills thousands downstream but preserves most of the Ethiopian structure. Addis Ababa retaliates with drone swarms and cyber attacks on Egypt's irrigation system, while Sudan implodes in a proxy civil war between pro-Egypt and pro-Ethiopia factions. Regional cascade. South Sudan collapses without stable nilotic flows, sending 2 million refugees to Uganda and Kenya, overwhelming already fragile systems. Probability of 25% per RAND Corporation simulations. In a moderate scenario, functional alliances sprout hesitantly. Ethiopia shares GERD telemetry data via African Union satellite. Egypt gains priority access to 600 megawatts of Ethiopian electricity via Red Sea submarine cables, and China mediates the deal in exchange for 20-year mineral contracts. But global climate intervenes mercilessly, precipitation reduced by 18% by 2040, per IPCC panels, making any pact fragile as quicksand. Let's explore counterfactuals to illuminate lost alternative paths. Suppose the GERD out collapsed in 2012 due to structural failures in cheap Chinese turbines. Ethiopia would accuse Western sabotage via past sanctions, accelerating a full pivot to Russia and Iran, trading hydraulic loyalty for S-400s and Shahed drones. Or imagine a Pan-African consortium led by the African Union taking control of the Nile Basin in 2010, excluding Egypt due to persistent Arab vetoes. A reality where Nelson Mandela, alive until 2020, negotiates truly equitable hydropolitics, inspired by his post-apartheid South African sharing model. Another divergence. What if the 1993 Oslo Accords had included Nile water clauses, linking Jordan and Israel to Ethiopia in a Mediterranean-African pact? These speculations are not frivolities. They reveal that water transcends national borders, demanding innovations like blockchain-backed virtual water banks, drought-predictive AI with 97% accuracy, or regional hydrological treaties shielded against regime changes. Let's delve deeper into other emblematic basins. The Congo River, the world's second-largest flow at 42,000 cubic meters per second, crosses 10 countries and houses the world's second lung in the Congo Basin. The Democratic Republic of Congo plans 120 dams by 2030 under the Inga 3 plan, a megastructure of 40,000 megawatts promising to electrify half of Africa, but threatening the Angolan Delta with 30% flow reductions. Angola counterattacks with hydroelectric plants on the Kwando Kubango, drying the Okavango Delta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site shared by Botswana, Namibia, and Angola, where ecosystems collapse. Elephant herds drink from muddy puddles, pink flamingos migrate in desperate clouds, and Botswana's ecotourism economy loses $2 billion annually. China exports turbines to Kinshasa and Luanga, capturing cobalts vital for electric vehicle batteries. In the Horn of Africa, the Juba and Shabelle rivers, sustaining Somali and Kenyan agriculture, dry up by 95% during the dry season due to Ethiopian diversions and civil wars. Al-Shabaab controls Somali headwaters, extorting Kenyan farmers with water protection fees, while Ethiopian drones and American special forces bomb insurgent depots. Somali pirates, recycled into water lords, drill artesian wells funded by old maritime extortions. In southern Africa, the Upper Zambezi pits Zambezi and Zimbabwe against each other over Kariba, a British relic from the 50s now cracked by accumulated sediments. 2024 droughts killed 60,000 tons of tigerfish, rationing Zambezian electricity to 20 hours daily without power. South Africa, 80% dependent on Lesotho via Lesotho, pressures through the Southern African Development Community for rigid quotas, threatening aid cuts amid Eskom's energy crisis. Microstates amplify the tragedy. Lesotho pumps water to the Vaal via 185-kilometer tunnels in the Malutu Mountains, generating 90% of its revenue, but residual glaciers evaporate with warming. Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, watches sugarcane wither from South African Komati diversions, pushing the absolute monarchy into alliances with Taiwan for drip technology. The socioeconomic impacts branch like underground roots. Women and girls bear the brunt. 45% of daily time on water collection in the Sahel, perpetuating poverty cycles where female education drops 30%. Gender violence explodes on isolated trails, with gang rapes as a water war weapon. Public health crumbles. Cholera outbreaks in Lagos kill 20,000 in 2025. Malaria proliferates in Congo stagnant pools. Child malnutrition hits 40% in Mozambique. Economically, Sub-Saharan GDP shrinks 2.5% annually from hydropenia, per World Bank, with foreign investors fleeing regulatory risks, currencies like the Nigerian naira devaluing 40%, and Chinese hydraulic debts suffocating national budgets. Solutions weave a tenuous thread of optimism. Solar desalination, pioneered in Oman, scales in Kenya with 100 million liter daily plants using floating panels on Lake Turkana. IBM and Google AI predicts droughts with 98% accuracy via Sentinel satellites, distributed through free African Union apps reaching 100 million users. Hydropolitical blocks evolve. The Nile Basin Initiative expands to 28 members with dynamic quotas based on rainfall. The Chad Authority launches drone fleets for transboundary monitoring. Biotechnology advances with Syngenta drought-resistant seeds doubling yields with 50% less water, and Yoruba cloud seeding projects in Niger induce artificial rains. But obstacles persist. Corruption diverts 40% of UN funds, populist nationalism trumps transnational solidarity, and climate change accelerates beyond projections. Human testimonies anchor the narrative. Aisha Ibrahim, 42-year-old Fulani fisherwoman on Lake Chad. My father filled nets with silverfish arm-sized. I return with algae and prayers, watching children swell with kwashiorkor. Tewodros Alamehu, 38-year-old Garrett chief engineer. Every spinning turbine is an Ethiopian cry against colonial yoke. We build our future, we don't bargain the era past. Anonymous Egyptian general, whispering in Cairo. The Nile is our blood. Cut the flow and all Egypt bleeds in collective agony. These voices echo the human drama behind cold statistics. For visionary investors, opportunities sprout amid chaos. Israeli purifier stocks like IDE Technologies rise 30% with Kenyan contracts. African blue water thematic ETFs yield 18% annually, blending Ethiopian hydro with South African biotech. But pitfalls abound. U.S. sanctions for human rights violations in Chinese projects, currency volatility, sovereign default risks. Philosophically, this crisis interrogates human essence. Rivers serve as eternal metaphors of time and change. They flow inexorably from sources to oceans, shaping valleys and civilizations along the way. Sub-Saharan Africa emerges as a global laboratory. Testing if humanity will share the collective flow or drown in nationalist greed puddles. Lessons resonate universally. Water recognizes no flags. Its governance demands planetary humility. Projections for 2030 paint stark dichotomies. Without coordinated intervention, 580 million internally displaced. Annual water wars claiming 2 million lives. Collapse of fragile states like Somalia and Chad. With bold vision, Africa leads the global green transition, exporting electrolytic hydrogen from Ethiopian and Congolese surpluses, capturing 30% of the European market and funding basin restoration. As narrator of this odyssey, I invite you, listener, to deep reflection. The next water drop touching your lips carries the sweat of an Ethiopian mother, the dream of a Nigerian fisherman, the determination of a nation reborn. This is the geopolitics of water scarcity in sub-Saharan Africa, not a distant abstraction, but the vital pulse of our interconnected world, where continents' fates are decided drop by drop.